The Big Ten suddenly has a little cachet after a couple big bowl victories, of course, a national championship, and add in a name brand coach. Mark Rogers TV talking about the Big Ten during spring practice. We bring in Aaron Torres of FoxSports.com to help us talk it up. Aaron, thanks so much for joining us here.
Mark, I appreciate you having me, and I'll tell you what, it is a good time to be a Big Ten football fan. Some coaching changes, as you mentioned, over the last few years. A lot of new blood in the conference, a lot of intrigue, and of course Ohio State coming off that national championship. As I said, it's a good time to be a Big Ten fan. That hasn't necessarily been the case for a while now.
It's amazing what can happen in the span of a few short weeks and a couple bowl games and championship wins when talking about Ohio State and then talking about Jim Harbaugh taking the reins in Ann Arbor. So those have been storylines 1 and 1A during the offseason. So let's talk Ohio State first off. 3 great quarterbacks. Cardale Jones, after 3 games, I would typically be hesitant in saying great, but maybe he made the most impressive 3-game run toward a championship in the history of college football. JT Barrett, of course, broke all sorts of records in the Big Ten, and Braxton Miller was the incumbent after being the Offensive Player of the Year in the Big Ten 2 years in a row. So can you start to size things up for us?
First of all, very good problem to have. 3 really good quarterbacks. An Ohio State fan brought this up to me the other day. This has to be the first time in the history of college football that we have not 2 but 3 established quarterbacks on one team. We've had really good quarterbacks at different schools, whether it be Tim Tebow, Chris Leak, Tim Tebow, Cam Newton, Matt Leinart, Matt Castle, whatever the case is. But no time have we ever seen 3 guys that have actually gone on the field and, as you said, performed. To kind of handicap it, I think the only thing they really handicap right now as we sit in the spring is that Cardale Jones is clearly the front runner to get the primary reps, for the rest of the spring and going into the fall, because he's the only one that's fully healthy. Urban Meyer is going to have some tough decisions to make. But right now, Cardale Jones, the only one that's healthy. JT Barrett can throw but can't really run. Braxton Miller can run but can't really throw. So, as I said, it'll be a good problem to have going forward. But right now, it's kind of Cardale Jones' job. And going forward, I think it'll be his job to lose to.
Hey, Aaron, when you take the pulse of the fans, it seems as though they typically say, how can you take this job away from Cardale Jones based on what he performed in those last 3 games, and the kid has a rocket arm. I was a skeptic just from the standpoint of how in the world with the lack of game experience. And once he got through Wisconsin, I thought, sure, that was extremely impressive. Give the kid all sorts of credit. But Nick Saban's got a month to prepare for this kid, and he was playing in front of the curve the entire time against Wisconsin like it was 7, 14, 21, nothing before you could blink. Wow, he's going to get into a tough situation against Alabama, down in distance, score, the whole deal. What's he going to do when he's got to put a drive together? And lo and behold, he gets down 21-6, and he brings back the Buckeyes in Louisiana against Alabama. It was just storybook stuff.
Yeah, no, it absolutely was, and I was in the same boat as you. You look at kind of player for player. Ohio State's clearly the better team than Wisconsin in the Big Ten championship, but I was kind of in the same boat of give Nick Saban time to prepare. Alabama last year, not so much going forward, but last year had the best secondary in the SEC, Landon Collins, a couple really good cornerbacks. They weren't – I didn't think, he was going to be able to have success throwing the deep ball. I didn't think he'd have success finding running lanes, which he actually did specifically well against Alabama, was picking up little chunks here and there. But it really was storybook, and it really was something that – look, I don't think we should feel guilty as college football fans and people who cover the sport about not seeing this coming, because I don't think Urban Meyer saw this coming. Urban Meyer kind of said after they beat Alabama and after they beat Oregon that he could have never imagined Cardale Jones making the giant leaps that he did really from the beginning of his career at Ohio State, but specifically even from the beginning of the season last year. So it was storybook. Like I said, I don't think any of us should feel guilty. Because it was something that even the coaching staff didn't see coming, and I'll be curious to see how he kind of develops this spring, with reps with the first team and kind of going into next year.
Aaron, I bring up the name Drew Brees because he is the name that JT Barrett vanquished from the Big Ten record books as being accountable for more touchdowns in one season than any quarterback in Big Ten history, and of course Drew Brees is going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer in the NFL. So the case could be made that JT Barrett over the long haul executed the offense better than anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's the most intriguing part. By the way, J.T. Barrett, another Texas kid that came up to play college football in the Big Ten, just like Drew Brees. Random side note, but it's fun, you know. But no, I think you're right. I think he executed the playbook the best. I think he's probably, as you know, Mark, and anybody watching this, the best kind of overall quarterback. You know, Braxton Miller, those raw athletic tools, not always great in the pocket. Cardale Jones, those raw athletic tools, different kinds of raw athletic tools, size, athleticism, big arm, as you mentioned. But J.T. Barrett's kind of the most balanced of the three. He's also the youngest of the three, which is really interesting as far as if somebody were to not play this year. I guess in theory it could be him. I think all three of them are going to play in some capacity if they all stay. But yeah, no, I think he's the most balanced of the three. I think you're absolutely right. He had the best grasp of the playbook, and you saw it because, you know, for all we talked about, you know, a few minutes ago about Cardale Jones really developing over the course of the season and really those 3 games, think about how much better J.T. Barrett got from that early season loss against Virginia Tech to those early Big Ten games to the late Big Ten games where he was really playing as good as any quarterback in the country relative to kind of his team and his skill set and things of the nature. And he was kind of playing himself into the Heisman conversation before he obviously went down with injury. So to me, I totally agree that he's probably the most skilled. I don't want to say the most skilled of the 3, but he's probably the most complete of the 3 in all phases of the game. And what that means for this specific battle at this specific time, I don't know. But I think he's got a bright future ahead, both at Ohio State and, of course, you know, potentially going forward to the next level.
And I think you bring up a really good point because you would think Braxton Miller would have the best grasp and the best feel for the offense because, of course, he's got the most experience going back to his freshman year. But J.T. Barrett, aside from the raw skills of just arm strength and speed, and for Cardale Jones, it's power running ability, J.T. Barrett was the guy that instantly scouts would say, wow, this kid anticipates throws, he anticipates windows, he's got the best pocket presence. He makes very good decisions for a guy with a lack of experience. Then you've got Braxton Miller, who almost plays like the inexperienced guy that's got a huge toolbox. He's more explosive than J.T. Barrett, better arm, but the offense hasn't really functioned. He's had to carry it on his back, so to his credit, he hasn't had the playmakers, at least early in his career, that he did a little bit later that Urban Meyer was able to surround him with.
Yeah, no, and I think you bring up an interesting point, but I also think the important thing to remember is that J.T. Barrett was the first quarterback that was recruited by Urban Meyer for this system. So obviously Braxton Miller has the in-game experience, but obviously at the same time Urban Meyer saw something in J.T. Barrett that made Urban Meyer want to bring him in as the first quarterback to sign with Ohio State under the Urban Meyer regime. So obviously there was something there. As far as Braxton Miller, you're right. The puzzle pieces, I'd be curious, really honestly, to see how Braxton Miller would fit with kind of the guys that have come about now. You know, I mean, Ezekiel Elliott was really young when Braxton Miller was last playing for Ohio State. Dontre Wilson was really young when Braxton Miller was last playing for Ohio State. So, you know, you look back to that last year where Braxton Miller played, and I guess it was Carlos Hyde. It feels like a lifetime ago, but, you know, he was the primary back, and he was the 1,000-yard rusher, and he had a great year, but not really kind of the dynamic, explosive playmakers that Urban Meyer and the coaching staff have since developed since Braxton Miller really got hurt. So I'd be very curious, and I'd be very interested to see, you know, how Braxton Miller could operate with kind of the skill guys that have since been developed in that system. And, you know, we might get that chance come the fall, you know, when things kick off in September.
Yeah, Braxton really got thrown into the fire. He was between Tressel and he was between Urban Meyer in that freshman season, and that was the year Pryor got suspended.
Yeah.
DeVere Posey was supposed to be his wide receiver, and Boom Herron at running back, 2 guys we see in the NFL right now, and those guys were taken away from him for most of the season, and he was thrown into the fire in what for Ohio State was an abysmal season.
Yeah,
and then enter Urban Meyer, things turn around at a place like that very quickly.
And if I can say something really quick there is I think that's such a dynamic, interesting storyline that's really kind of evolved over the last year and change is that I don't want to say Braxton Miller saved Ohio State football. He didn't save Ohio State football, but they were in a very weird position where kind of when he committed, that everything was going good, and then before he even got to campus, the NCAA started snooping around. Jim Tressel kind of, things got wishy-washy with him, and he eventually left. And Braxton Miller stuck with that program, stuck with the coaching change from Jim Tressel to Luke Fickell, and then Luke Fickell to Urban Meyer. And I think, in the haste of, JT Barrett mania, which obviously turned into Cardale Jones mania, people forget how important Braxton Miller was as kind of a stabilizing force with this program. And people forget, oh, by the way, he won his first 24 games, I guess, as a starter for Urban Meyer. And a lot of the success that they are having now, whether Braxton Miller ever plays another down for Ohio State, and I think he will, but whether he does or not, I think it can't be under-mentioned, underappreciated, whatever, the role that he played in, like I said, kind of stabilizing this program. I'm not saying he saved Ohio State football. I'm not saying anything like that. But what I am saying is he was a stabilizing force, led them to a lot of wins, which actually allowed a lot of these younger guys like the Ezekiel Elliott's, Dontre Wilson's, guys that we mentioned, to develop. And then obviously JT Barrett didn't miss a beat when he took over last fall.
Aaron, I'm going to wrap two questions into one before we move on to Michigan, and that's, I would think if Braxton Miller was going to transfer, he would have done it by now. I was astounded that he hasn't made a move at this point. You look at a place like LSU and you see boatloads of talent all over the place, except they need a quarterback. They need a guy that can pull the trigger. So he's in a situation in a three-man battle. I've heard odd rumors about him switching positions, Urban Meyer setting him up and saying, hey, this is where your pro potential is. Man, this kid's such a great quarterback, or a great potential quarterback, that I can't imagine him doing that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I've heard every variation of things from people who cover these teams, from people who cover the sport nationally, from fans. You hear it from all angles, and I think I was thinking about it this morning as I kind of prepared for this interview, Mark, and I think that we're kind of in college basketball season right now. John Calipari's gotten a lot of credit for his ability to kind of mold this team and get guys to sacrifice, and I kind of think that Urban Meyer is going to prove himself to be the John Calipari of college football. First of all, as you said, keeping all three of those guys around, I think one is a testament to Urban Meyer. Two, it's a testament to these kids that they all want to compete. Now, I'm not necessarily surprised that Braxton Miller decided to stay at least throughout the semester or the quarter or whatever weird system that Ohio State operates on. Somebody brought up a good point to me of, he's been working with the same doctors and trainers and in the same facility. And, when you're in the middle of rehab, it's a lot to kind of just pick up and leave. He obviously could do that during the summer. We've seen it happen. We saw it happen most successfully with Russell Wilson a few years back going to Wisconsin kind of in the middle of the summer. I don't know what the future holds. I'm not so surprised that, that he stayed, but I do agree with you in the sense that Braxton Miller is going to be a quarterback somewhere next year, and whether Urban Meyer figures out a way to use all three of these guys, whether Braxton Miller decides, it's LSU or it's Florida State or wherever it may be, he's going to be a quarterback, and he's been a quarterback his whole life, and he's been a darn good quarterback, I should say, his whole life. I emphasized the wrong word there, but he's been a good quarterback his whole life. He's going to be under center. I don't know where, but I suspect that whatever it is, he's going to figure out a way to continue to play quarterback. It's just a matter of where.
Aaron Torres joins us from FoxSports.com. Aaron, I'm going to take us back like 15 years because at the end of the John Cooper reign at Ohio State, and I use the term reign very loosely, I knew some Michigan fans who were very down on the rivalry, thinking, hey, I know Ohio State's just about as good as we are in all the other games, but we've dominated this series for so long, it's hurt the rivalry. And here we fast forward 15 years, and Ohio State's won, whatever it is, 10-12, and one of those you can almost cast aside as the Luke Fickell year, and Ohio State's dominated the series. Jim Tressel, 9 out of 10. So here we stand at a point where, from that perspective, Ohio State's still in great shape, but wow, Jim Harbaugh is on campus at Michigan, and there's a whole new vibe, whole new feel, whole new energy there at Michigan.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you, and I don't remember those John Cooper years as vividly, but you look back at all the players that were coming out of Ohio State at that point, Orlando Pace and Sean Springs and David Boss and all these guys, and they just couldn't beat Michigan. And I can't remember specifically, but if memory serves me correct, the guy was basically fired because he couldn't beat Michigan. And it's incredible to see the rivalry kind of reverse the way it has. And I give all the credit in the world to Michigan, because there was only one guy that they could get that all of us as commentators on college football, that fans, that everyone would agree is a home run hire that can't miss, that's going to turn this program around. That was Jim Harbaugh. Now, obviously there was the Les Miles rumors, but he's already turned the job down a couple of times. Les Miles is actually deceptively older than you think he is. He's like 61, 62 years old. He wouldn't have been there for the long haul. And so there really was only one guy that they could get. And there were other good candidates on the market. You know, I still think Greg Schiano is going to potentially be a good coach somewhere someday. I don't think it'll be great. I don't think he's going to the Hall of Fame. But, you know, there were good coaches out there. But there was only one guy that the whole world would agree is can't miss, home run. And they went out and got him. And look, only Jim Harbaugh knows, you know, what the circumstances were that led him to Michigan, whether, you know, what the other NFL opportunities might have been, what, you know, what other, you know, whether he wanted to take a year out, whatever the case was. Only Jim Harbaugh knows. But the fact is, Michigan kind of planted their flag in the ground and said, we are going to get this guy. Credit to them. They got their guy. They waited a long time for the guy, and I don't know if that's because they had been, you know, kind of talking to Harbaugh on the side or whatever. But, you know, they waited and waited and waited, and we as commentators, or at least myself as a commentator, I'll admit it, I said, what are these guys doing? They better get Harbaugh. If they don't get Harbaugh, you know, what are they going to do? Well, they got Harbaugh, and as you said, it's been kind of a complete 360, at least from a PR perspective, in terms of Michigan now being on the tips of recruiting, you know, recruiting analyst tongues as far as a school that kids are interested in. It's a fun, cool school again, you know, after being kind of, you know, without a reputation for the last few years. And I'm very curious to see how this program develops under Jim Harbaugh.
And I think you're alluding to a good point here. It's a perfect marriage in this aspect as well. The Michigan man, as I think of him, as Bo Schembechler and Lloyd Carr, the ultra-conservative, staunch guy. And if they would have gotten that guy, yeah, sure, maybe he could have been a capable coach, X's and O's, and building a program from that standpoint. But they needed so much more, and they get the Michigan guy. They get the guy that they wanted. They get the guy that represents the university. It's the biggest name produced by that university currently in football active. But they also get the cool guy. They get the guy that gives Michigan a vibe and an energy that they haven't had since Charles Woodson probably.
And what I would say is this, is in 2015, I don't know if it's enough to be stoic and regal and, you know, a proper, you know, to-do gentleman. Like, that might have worked wonderfully in 1920, but when you're trying to recruit against Urban Meyer, who's a bulldog on the recruiting trail, even Nick Saban, bulldog on the recruiting trail, Kevin Sumlin, you know, you go on and on down the list, Brian Kelly. These guys are all great recruiters. They're great marketers of their program. They sell their program well. And, you know, you have to have a little bit of flash in 2015. And you know, I kind of mentioned Kevin Sumlin. We know he rides around in helicopters, and he'll land his helicopter on a high school football field and make a grand entrance. And I'm not saying everybody has to be like that, to be that extreme, but you got to have some of that in you. Jim Harbaugh has it. You know, we've seen him. I got to tell you, I don't follow many athletes and coaches on Twitter because they don't really say anything interesting in general. Jim Harbaugh is awesome. Like, you talk about the Twitter find of 2015, like, Jim Harbaugh is incredible to follow on Twitter. Like you said, he's made it the cool school. I thought, you know, something that completely flew under the radar, which I thought was huge, was this little thing where Jameis Winston and Bryce Petty were working out at the facility in the lead up to the combine. That might not mean much to most people, and they might not see it as much. I see that as huge because, oh, by the way, you have, you know, Johnny Smith from down the street recruit, you know, a junior in high school coming to visit your campus, taking an unofficial visit, maybe popping by campus, and there's Jameis Winston and Bryce Petty working out, getting ready for the combine. That's huge. Those are the kinds of things that sell. You know, I mentioned John Calipari earlier in this interview. You know, he's a guy that all his former players come to work out at Kentucky in the summer. You think that doesn't have an effect on the sophomores and juniors in high school coming up? Same deal at Michigan, same deal with football. As you said, he's made it the cool school. All of a sudden, people are talking about Michigan. You know, these big-time stars are working out at Michigan, and Ndamukong Suh was there for a few days. Jameis Winston commenting on how great the facilities are, and, you know, I love Florida State, but I would have loved to play here too. I mean, these things matter in recruiting. As you said, Jim Harbaugh has made this a cool school again, and I am so intrigued to see not only how the success that they have, but also just the reality of what they can do in recruiting going forward as Jim Harbaugh kind of quote-unquote rebrands this program.
So, Aaron, while Jim Harbaugh can help women in strategy, the heroes, her story come out just a few weeks ago, he's not necessarily going to be able to walk on water. So let's make the delineation right there.
Yeah.
How good can Michigan be right out of the gate this season?
Well, right out of the gate, I think they'll be improved, and the biggest reason why is this. Look, we know they're not going to compete for Big Ten champion. They're not going to playoff. We get all that. Like, we understand that, but the thing is, when I watched Michigan last year, there were places where they had some talent. Obviously, Devin Funchess, the wide receiver, was really good. Didn't have a quarterback to throw to him. There are places where they're talented. The one place that stood out to me as a fan, and I remember I was watching the Utah game. They played Utah very early in the season. Utah turned out to be a very good team. We know they competed for the Pac-12 South Championship. But what surprised me watching that game was Utah just beat up Michigan in the trenches. And I sat there and I watched it and I said, I remember it was like the second week of the season. I go, Brady Hoke's going to get fired, man. And I'm not a big, we need to fire everybody and, get this guy out of here. But it was like, they can't block. And if you can't block, you can't do anything in football, and specifically on the offensive side of the ball. And the reason I bring all that up is because the one thing that I think Jim Harbaugh will instill in this program right away is toughness. And kind of an attitude and a chip on your shoulder. And look, we all know it's all cute, yay, rah, rah, let's get tough. But it's not going to translate to 10 wins right away or 11 wins right away. But you kind of need that culture change. That we're the big bad bully on the block. That's what he did when he got to San Francisco. Obviously, a completely different scenario, pros versus college. But it's also what he did at Stanford. So. I don't think Stanford is quite the blueprint because I don't think Michigan is as far off talent-wise as Stanford was, what really took 4 or 5 years. But, I think this team finds a way to get to 6 wins, maybe 7, go to a bowl game, and then really build momentum and really kind of do the things in recruiting that they need to do to kind of, as you mentioned, build the depth back up, kind of get the players at Michigan that you need to really compete, specifically with Ohio State, but even their cross-state rival, Michigan State. It's going to take a few years, but Harbaugh is going to start to get those players in and develop them.
Aaron, before I let you go, one of my favorite stats from the last couple of years in college football, one of the strangest stats I've heard. Fitz Toussaint, their main running back 2 years ago against Penn State, 27 carries, 27 yards. Yeah, they have not been able to – wait, you hear 8 carries, 11 yards, but to give it to him 27 times, he couldn't get more than a yard per carry. That's amazing to me, and that has lasted for the last few years. So, to extend your point, elite athletes not coming to Michigan, we can understand from an athletic standpoint, not keeping up with Ohio State or an SEC team, but just not being able to block anybody or have that toughness that we expect out of a Michigan football team has been rather alarming over the last few years, but very much expect that to change.
Yeah,
Aaron Torres from FoxSports.com joining us to talk up some Big Ten football. Aaron, we appreciate the information and the insight.
No problem, Mark. I appreciate it. One thing I would add on Harbaugh, by the way, you mentioned elite athleticism, all that. The one thing that I think is being totally undersold here is the fact that he got guys at Stanford, and he developed them, and I think that's an important key for Michigan. We all know the population demographics and things of the nature that there aren't as many good players in the Midwest in general, and certainly in Michigan. So you got to have a guy that can eye a kid at 16, 17 years old and see him 4 or 5 years down the road and what he could be. I think that's a very important part of this Jim Harbaugh thing to Michigan is he doesn't have to – I'm not saying he doesn't have to be an elite recruiter, but he's proven that he doesn't need elite recruits to win. I think that's going to be big at Michigan, just to kind of follow up on that point you just brought up.
Yeah, you've got 2 main rivals there that do it rather well in Wisconsin and, of course, Michigan State. But, he did it to the nth degree there at Stanford for a team that was winning like 1 or 2 games a year and suddenly a BCS team and overcoming 40-point spreads against the likes of USC was pretty amazing. Aaron Torres of FoxSports.com joining us. Hey, Aaron, love the talk about the Big Ten. Would love to sit down at some point in the future.
Mark, I appreciate you having me anytime you need me. The pleasure was mine, and it's always good to talk football, my friend.